Hello, Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. This is a long show today. I really wish I could trim it down to like 15 minutes, but that just doesn't seem very likely. Now, I recommend using the timestamps on the video to skip things that you don't care about because most of you don't want to watch a 20-minute video. First up today from Kamayana, we've got a change in display for items that have multiple actions associated with them. There isn't very much to say about this, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. For items that have multiple actions, you will now see that those actions are listed in the activation menu or similar menus that show that information. There are some caveats, however. If you run the game in a small window, it will likely cut off some item names. It also only works for things that have two actions. If something has more than two, they won't all be displayed in this way. Now, I was a little worried about this when I first saw it. I always play the game scaled up 25% because it makes it look nicer on mobile for me recording and making a video. However, for me, most gun names, even at 125%, are not long enough to be disrupted by this new display. Now, I'm sure this will be problematic for someone out there, but it seems unlikely to affect very many people. And if that is you, well, I'm sorry, I don't really have a recommendation to fix that problem. Moving along from Kate Monster 33, we've got mouse hover support for inventory screens. Now, we have in the past gotten various PRs that add some small amount of mouse support throughout the different areas of the game. Now, it is very random where you can use your mouse and where you can't, but I like to shout out stuff like this when I see it. This PR added support for hovering, which means essentially that when you mouse over something in the inventory, it will become highlighted. This means that if you're using the mouse, you will see it responding as you move the mouse around. Previously, the item was not actually highlighted until you actually clicked on it. So even though there was mouse support previously in the inventory screen, you wouldn't necessarily know that because it didn't respond to you mousing over anything. So ultimately, this is a pretty straightforward change that will make it more apparent that your mouse is supported in the inventory screen. In the future, this could be used for all menus with mouse support to quickly communicate that that particular menu does in fact support the mouse. Now, hopefully that all made sense. Next up from Flyby306, we got a PR about acid blood refinement. Now, I was extremely confused by this PR because I thought there was a pretty firm developer statement that this would never be permitted. People have brought this up for years that they wanted to harvest acid from zombies or other animals and then refine that into like a chemical acid they could use for crafting. Now, I recall many of those conversations ending with, no, we don't want to do that. But apparently that has changed, so let's just talk about it here. I assume it's because we've got chemistry proficiencies and recipes and things like that now, which make it a lot more valid. Now, essentially, you can use a blood draw kit or the bleed option in the butcher menu to harvest acid blood from a variety of creatures in the game. This will then give you a form of acid blood, which will vary based on which creature you harvested. Then you can refine this into proper acid using your chemistry recipes. Acidic plant type monsters will give different blood from acidic zombie types, which is different blood from acidic insects, and etc, etc. Now, because of these differences, they are used to refine into different acids as well. The recipes require personal protective equipment and other materials that you would expect it to require as a chemistry type recipe. Mostly, I don't really like this change, but I recognize that I'm not into chemistry, and so my opinions on the ratios of blood to refined acid, it's probably just from my own lack of knowledge. That said, it is time consuming without proficiencies. It does require a lot of proficiencies and personal protective equipment as well. I just personally don't really care for the idea of harvesting acid from these creatures, but again, that's not based in facts, that's just my, knee-jerk reaction. Now, regardless, it is in the game now, and once you have the chemistry proficiencies, it's actually pretty quick to craft a lot of these acids. Now, I don't really know what recipes require a bunch of acid, but you now have the opportunity to harvest and refine it from acidic creatures. Next up today from Kevin, we had the removal of the option to disable skill rust. Now, this was a debug option that existed because skill rust was previously very broken. So back in the day, they provided us a way to disable it because it didn't work properly. However, it was reworked a while back and skill rust is no longer broken, and therefore the option to disable it has been removed. Now, despite the fact that I just explained this logic behind this change and the fact that it makes absolutely perfect sense, people are still irritated by it. So I wanted to mention it. However, you not liking skill rust is not a valid reason for this option to continue existing. Ultimately, I cannot convince you to like this change, but it makes perfect sense to me and it has been removed. Next up today from Guardian DLL, we've got snippets added to various electronics. Now if you don't know, a snippet is just a chunk of text, and they're organized in different ways. So for example, the survivor notes that you find in the game, they use a certain set of snippets, and then the child notes that you can find in the game use a different selection of snippets. And now, thanks to this PR, smartphones and tablets that you find in the game can contain their own snippets. These include things like descriptions of photos that you find on the phone, conversations or emails from the original owner, things like that. And while this ultimately has no gameplay impact at all, I think this is just a really great idea. I really like this a lot. I'm a big fan of world building and flavor, and this simple addition of text has the potential to add some really neat background. And unlike our survivor notes, which are often very poorly written with intentional, terrible spelling for no reason, these seem much more reasonable and therefore are a lot more fun to read. So yeah, I really like this change. With the addition of child notes that we discussed in a previous video, we've gotten a large number of flavorful snippets lately, which again is infinitely better than some of the complete nonsense, all caps swearing garbage that some of the old survivor notes are. Moving along here, next up from A Noob in Disguise, we've got feral cops. Now my first thought upon seeing this was that I'm just so incredibly sick of seeing ferals with guns, and I was ready to scream about how they are ruining the balance of the game. But then, to my surprise, I found that these creatures don't actually use firearms, and my sphincter unclenched and that vein in my neck receded. So basically, these are ferals, which, you are probably familiar at this point with the basic abilities of ferals, and instead of having them use a firearm or throwing rocks like 99% of their brethren, these creatures will use a whistle to alert nearby creatures to the player. Essentially, this is a feral version of a shrieker zombie. Once you get into melee with them, they will use a baton to attack, and when killed, the exact thing that they drop will be randomized among various batons in the game. Their faction is also unique in that they will not be attacked by police robots. This seems like a necessity since they can spawn in place of a regular cop zombie, and since we treat police bots as sort of recognizing police enemies as their allies, it was a good choice to do things this way, I think. Now, other than that, they are pretty much exactly what you expect. There was a second PR that made it so that these will eventually evolve into regular cop zombies, which, makes sense with our lore. So over time, these will become less common, and I really don't have any other thoughts on them. Next up from Maleclypse, we've got a change that makes it so turrets can target vehicles. Now you might think that they already did this, but they actually did not. Previously, in order for a gun-type creature to attack something, it had to target a player or NPC or monster very specifically. Vehicles were never regarded as a valid target, and this is why some people would just crouch down in the driver's seat and ram turrets. If the turret couldn't see them, it could never shoot, and thus you could easily defeat them. Now I won't even pretend to understand all the code and whatnot that went into this. All I can say is that turrets now will indeed target your vehicle even if they can't see you specifically. Now they do only target moving vehicles as well, so you don't need to worry about them shooting up nearby parked cars or anything like that. Now depending on the turret, this could be very problematic for you, as rounds can easily pierce your windshield and they will rip up the front end of your car, things like that. It's very easy for a turret to destroy your engine, and then that, of course renders you immobile and puts you in a pretty dangerous predicament. Now I know I'm not giving it a lot of time here in the video, but this actually is a pretty big deal, and it's something the devs have talked about for years now. It also seems to apply to other shooting enemies, I think is what the PR said. So for instance, a feral with a gun may also target a moving vehicle instead of having to see you specifically as the player. And all of this does make sense because vehicles only move as the result of a player's actions. It's not something that an NPC or a monster, they can't really move vehicles. Anyway, yeah, like I said, I don't know how to talk about, the details of the coding here. I think it's a fantastic change, and we're just going to have to see, does it work flawlessly, or are there some quirks we need to be aware of, things like like that, and we won't know that probably for a couple weeks. Next up today from A Noob in Disguise, we've got yet another rework to Gambesons. I don't think I've ever said the word Gambeson out loud. I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. Now, I wasn't super familiar with them to begin with, and this PR is basically just an enormous wall of text, so forgive me if I missed some things. Now, the obvious change here that was brought to my attention by Discord is that several Gambeson items have now been obsoleted. This means they will no longer appear in your crafting menu or spawn anymore, but if you already had them in your save, they will continue existing. Now, the main ones that were hit here were the Kevlar Gambesons, and the reason in the PR explains that they were too similar to the Survivor jumpsuits and ballistic vests. Now, if you want to argue about that, again, I'm not really familiar personally. I don't have much of an opinion here. Now, the other thing in this PR is that Gambesons were split into two separate garments. One is the Akaton, which I have no idea if I'm saying that right, never seen that word before. These are normal layer garments that appear to be relatively thin, like padding under armor. Now, the other part are the Gambesons themselves, which is an outer layer garment that is thicker than the Akaton. This also involved some common sense changes to these items. If you look at the old Gambesons, their weights and volumes were pretty ridiculous for the size that they were supposed to be. And once again, I know Gambesons are a fan favorite and people out there have many opinions about them. I'm sure someone out there is going to be irritated by this, maybe even a lot of people. I just personally am not informed enough to have opinions on them in the game. I know I keep saying that, it's really just because I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a lot of comments about this, and I don't really know what to say about them. In addition to these changes, their material requirements were reworked, as were the crafting times and etc. I initially thought that these changes to crafting times were, they made sense. Stitching a Gambeson by hand, it has to be like really tight and there's a lot of sewing involved. However, that said, it appears to, without proficiencies, it takes like 120 hours of work, which seems really high to me. I personally don't think it would take me 120 hours in real life to stitch a Gambeson, and I'm not a skilled tailor or anything. But anyway, you can have a look at this PR if you're interested in finding out more specific details. It will be linked in the description down below. I know the Gambeson was a go-to piece of armor for many people, so this has the potential to affect a lot of players. Next up today from Bombastic Slacks, we have a change to character creation. Now, before we even get started here, I want to be very clear. You can still use multi-pull or single pull points as you always have. As far as I know, those things still work exactly the same as they did a week ago. Whether it will eventually change or not, I can't speak to that, but I have seen some very negative reactions to this change, even though it appears to be completely optional. Now, with all that said, character creation is pretty broken and nonsense, and it has been pretty broken for many years. Point costs for different traits have been revised probably dozens of times in the last several years, and people are constantly arguing over what is the most effective combinations, how to min-max everything, or they argue over what the point costs for their favorite trait should be. Contributors and devs have been aware of this for a long time, and we hoped to move away from a point-based system. Instead, we would let you select more or less whatever you wanted within reason, and then display your character's power level to give you an idea of how easy or difficult it would be to play that character. And that's ultimately what this PR does. If you use the new style of character creation, you will not encounter point limitations. It's a version of freeform, something that has existed in the game for many years. Now, at the top of your screen, you will see information regarding your player's abilities. If you set your strength to 20, then the offense line in character creation will become the word overpowered. The idea here being that we should let players play however they want and simply inform them if they're making a reasonable, overpowered, or underpowered character. Now, there is some nuance to this, and no, I don't know specifically what all affects each individual category. They are outlined in the PR if you want to take a look, but I don't know if that was written before or after the changes were finalized, so, I wasn't sure about relaying all that information to you. But I do know that this is the direction that we're moving in, and that it has been discussed at length for many years now. So although I've seen some people dislike this, and there was one person who was really angry on Discord, but ultimately I think this is a good thing for the game. It will surely be refined in the future as they puzzle out better ways to display this information or refine the calculations and etc. And for those of you who don't like it, well, at least for the time being, the old single pool and multi-pool options still exist. So, currently, no one is forcing you to change your experience. And yeah, that's the gist of it. I don't know if it will look like this forever, but I'd recommend you give it a look over next time you start a character. Try toggling lots of things in the menu and see the different categories change, get a feel for how all of that works, but it is ultimately pretty straightforward. Next up today, we've got about 1 million freaking PRs related to a new mod which started with bombastic slacks. Now, I normally don't cover mods, but this one seems pretty fantastic, and also there's been a bunch of additions and changes to it over the last couple of weeks. Very simply, this mod makes it so that you can accumulate experience in the game similar to the stats through kills mod, and then when you get enough experience, you can unlock a perk. Now, I love perk systems in games. They offer a lot of freedom and creativity, adding more diversity to how you can build your character. And yes, I did play every freaking Fallout game that's ever been released. That's definitely not making me biased or anything. Anyway, I was initially going to cover this in like a ton of detail, but it's like, I don't know that I could possibly really go over every perk or anything like that. So instead, let's just take a look at how this works in general, and I'll show you some screenshots of the UI and etc. So unfortunately, as soon as I enabled this mod, I encountered an issue immediately. Apparently, when you start a new character with this mod enabled, you get this little line in the log telling you that the perk window will open in 30 seconds. Unfortunately, I did not see this, and so I spent the next 10 minutes of the game trying to test the mod, and I couldn't level up, I couldn't open the perk menu, or do anything related to the mod. It appears that when you start a game, you have to wait 30 seconds for the initial configuration menu to actually pop up. And if you don't do this, then the mod is broken and you can't use it unless you use the debug menu to work around your mistake. I gotta be honest, this is pretty not good design. Many starting scenarios need you to act in the first 30 seconds, but in my case, moving around broke the mod and I never got the pop-up. 30 seconds seems like a really long time if there are nearby enemies, and I was very frustrated when I played for 10 minutes and I couldn't get anything to work. But anyway, let's not dwell on the negative. Once we've got the pop-up, you will have a new trait listed in your character menu, which you can activate through the mutations menu. When you activate it, it will then display a list of possible perks that you can unlock, as well as some basic information regarding your experience and points that you have to assign. Experience seems to be based on the enemy that you kill. I believe historically this used the difficulty rating of creatures, and the difficulty rating is a product of enemy stats, and the largest variation there would be hit points, so high HP creatures provide the most experience. Or at least historically, that's how that worked. I never saw that change, so I assume it still works that way. Selecting a perk from this menu will then display a small description of that trait and give you the option to select it if you have points available to obtain that trait. By default, some perks have prerequisites which will be displayed when you select that perk in this list. Overall, I don't have a lot of feedback for this mod. I think most things are self-explanatory. You gain experience and you unlock a perk. I like the idea of perks in general. I enjoy games that use them as part of leveling up. I will say the display could probably use a little work. I would prefer if you could hover over a perk and get its description rather than you having to select it and then go back every time you just want to check some information. And additionally, as I stated, I think waiting 30 seconds for the initial pop-up is very strange, and it leaves room for people like me to make a mistake and never know why we weren't able to use the mod. I ultimately had to ask on Discord because I didn't understand why it just didn't work right out of the box. As for the variety of additional PRs, they cleaned things up a little bit and they did add a couple of additional perks to this menu. At the moment, I did not test this extensively. I don't know how many perks there actually are in total that are obtainable, but this is the sort of thing that offers a lot of creative freedom, and I'm hopeful that people will implement additional perks in the future. Worst case scenario, someone can grab the giant list of perks from New Vegas or whatever and see how many of them can be adopted to this game. I didn't see a list of criteria or restrictions on content submission, so yeah, I don't know, if you have ideas, maybe you can add some perks to this mod. Anyway, I think this is a pretty great mod, which I say as someone who I don't play with mods at all. I would encourage you to give it a shot, especially if it continues getting more additions. And then finally today from MNG Cataclysm, we've got our first mission for the Exodii faction. Now I'm not going to show anything on screen here. It's a very straightforward quest. It's not, the rewards don't really need talking about. It's not something complicated that you need a walkthrough on. So I mostly just wanted to point it out. Next time you are hanging out with the Exodii, they will probably have a quest for you, and this is the first quest in a chain of quests that will appear, presumably in the near future. This was initially outlined by Urk, it was made by MNG Cataclysm, and yeah, I don't know, spoilers, that's probably all I'm going to say about it. Probably should have put that at the top of the show since I'm not really talking about it, but whatever, we can end on that note. And with that, I think that is the end of the recording. Everybody, thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I did have some other stuff that I had made that I was gonna tack on to the end of the show, but ultimately we're at 20 minutes already, so I think we're just gonna call it here. So everybody, thank you for watching. I, of course, will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode, and I'll see you next time.